complete fulfillment of the fall of Babylon, which in Ellen White's day was yet future. But we are on the brink of the great and final events, which Ellen White declares to be rapid ones. But we sleep on. Notice what this says. In giving an outline of this subject, I shall for the most part follow Keith in his Signs of the Times on the first 4 trumpets. When I said Litch earlier, that's because that's who Litch followed. Okay? In his Signs of the Times on the first 4 trumpets, I should be glad to give his remarks and historical quotations entire, would my limits, which are prescribed for this work, admit it. The subject properly begins with the 2nd verse of the 8th chapter, and the 1st verse should have been annexed to the 7th chapter, it being the conclusion of the opening of the seals. From verses 2 to 5 of the 8th chapter, we have the prefatory remarks prefatory to the sounding of the first angel, and then he says, the first trumpet. The 7 angels, which had the 7 trumpets, prepared themselves to sound. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast to the earth, and the 3rd part of the trees was burnt up. The first sore and heavy judgment which fell upon Western Rome in its downward course was the war with the Goths under Alaric, styled by himself the Scourge of God. It began in January of 395. I recommend that you dump this off of your CD-ROM and read the whole contents of this little 68-page pamphlet. We're just going to cover some of the major points. The birth of Alaric, the glory of his past exploits, and the confidence in his future designs insensibly united the body of the nation under his victorious standard. He's talking about the pagans that he was, the barbarians that he was leading. And with the unanimous consent of the barbarian chieftains, the master general of Illyricum, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I'm not sure I am, was elevated, according to ancient custom, on a shield and solemnly proclaimed king of the Visigoths. Armed with his double power, seated on the verge of 2 empires, he alternately sold his deceitful promises to the courts of Arcadius and to Honorius. Those were the 2 emperors, one in the west and one in the east, of Constantinople and Rome, till he declared and executed his resolution of invading the dominions of the Western Rome. The provinces of Europe, which belonged to the Eastern Empire, were already exhausted. Those of Asia were inaccessible, and the strength of Constantinople had resisted his attack. But he was tempted by the fame, the beauty, and the wealth of Italy, which he had twice visited, and he secretly aspired to plant the Gothic standard on the walls of Rome and to enrich his army with the accumulated spoils of 300 triumphs. So you can see here that the advantages of having yourself in the glory and the honor and the greatness of this might of this world will lead in the pillage of all your riches. Alaric is the demonstration that all those who follow the world are going to come to a bitter, bitter end.
That's right.
And under the 2nd trumpet, the 2nd angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the 3rd part of the sea became blood, and the 3rd part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the 3rd part of the ships were destroyed. The history illustrative of the sounding of this trumpet has been given so fully in the 1st chapter of this volume that it will be unnecessary to repeat it here. The reader will find it at large in the exposition of Daniel 11:30. It relates to the invasion and conquest of Africa and afterward of Italy by the terrible Genseric. He's telling you here that in Daniel 11 you can find the same history of the sounding of the 2nd trumpet. His conquests were for the most part naval, and his triumphs were, as it were, a great mountain burning with fire cast into the sea. The repetition of 1 or 2 extracts from Gibbon must suffice, and he goes on to describe this for us. And that was 428 under Genseric. He was the leader of the Vandals. And then under the third trumpet, the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the river and upon the fountains of waters, and the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many died, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. A third angel sounded, and a third name is associated with the downfall of the Roman Empire. The sounding of the trumpets manifestly denotes the order of the commencement, not the period of the duration of the wars or events. In other words, he's saying they're sequential, which they represent. When the second angel sounded, there was seen, as it were, a great mountain burning with fire. When the third angel sounded, there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were with a lamp. The symbol in each instance is expressly a similitude, and the one is to the other in comparative and individual resemblance, as a burning mountain to a falling star. Each of them was great. The former was cast into the sea, the latter was first seen as falling, and it fell upon the fountains and the rivers of water. There is a discrimination and similitude in the description and locality, which obviously implies a corresponding difference in the object represented. Now, these men had reasoning powers, which today we've lost, but on such plain and preliminary observations, we may look to the information given in the third trumpet and to the achievements of Attila the Hun, the third name mentioned by Gibbon, and associated in equal rank with Alaric and Genseric in the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire. The year was 468.
The first one was the Visigoths, you said, right? Alaric?
Yes.
Thank you.
And then the fourth trumpet. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened. And the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. At the voice of the first angel, and the blast of his trumpet, the whole Roman world was in agitation. If you compare this with the fall of Jericho, and you read the account, you'll see that when they walked around the city the first time and blew that trumpet, the whole city was in agitation. What you see in the story of when they crossed the Jordan, I'm telling you that God was standing on a sea of glass with those who'd gotten the victory over the mark and his number and his name that very day. Because what he was about to do at Jericho, he's going to accomplish at the end of the world. In such a marvelous fashion. And friends, he will accomplish it under the sounding of the seventh trumpet. We're not dealing with somebody who doesn't know what he's doing here. We're dealing with the God of heaven.
Amen.
And he has tied this together airtight. There's no wiggle room out of this. So that's the fourth trumpet. That is, well, we didn't get, is it Odieser?
Yeah, who was he?
Now, let me see. At the voice of the first angel and the blast of his trumpet, the whole Roman world was in agitation, and the storms of war passed over it all. The union of the empire was dissolved, a third part of it fell, and the transalpine provinces were separated from the empire. Under the second trumpet, the provinces of Africa, another of the maritime part, was in like manner reft from Rome, and the Roman ships were destroyed in the sea and even in their harbor. The empire of Rome, hemmed in on every side, was then limited to the kingdom of Italy. Within its bounds and along the fountains and rivers of waters, the third trumpet re-echoed. See, now, what it's telling us is the first two trumpets have completely surrounded the nation of Italy. And their maritime provinces are gone. Their provinces in Spain and in Portugal and all those parts of the barbarian places where the invaders came from are all gone. Their only support now is they're trembling in the city of Rome, and they're waiting for what next calamity might fall. And what falls is Odieser. Notice what he does. The last barrier of the empire of Rome was broken. The plains of Lombardy were ravaged by a foreign foe, and from thence new enemies arose to bring an end to the strife of the world with the imperial city. Though the union of the empire was dissolved, there was still an emperor in Rome. The majesty of the Roman name was not obliterated, though tarnished. And after the middle of the 5th century, the Caesars still had a successor in their own city. But the palace of Milan could not again be the temporary abode of the Roman court when it was the seat and center of a hostile power. And the marshes of Ravenna ceased to be a security after the waters were made bitter, and when hordes of Huns mingled with other savages on the northern region of Italy. The time too had long passed for realizing the project which the terror of the Goths had first suggested, or transferring the court of Rome to the shores of Africa and transforming Carthage into another Constantinople. The remnant or the refuse of previous invasions was enough to destroy the last remaining parts of Roman greatness in Italy and to abolish the office of the name of the Emperor of Rome. Long had that name been a terror to the nations and identified with supreme authority in the world. Long had the Emperor of Rome shone and ruled the earth like the sun in its firmament. His was a kingdom and dominion great and terrible, and strong exceedingly, to which all others were subjected and subordinate. His supreme or imperial authority had in the decline of the empire been greatly obscured, but till then it had never been extinguished. It had been darkened and disfigured by a great storm, eclipsed as it were by a mountain that burned with fire, and outshone as it were by a falling star like a fiery meteor. It had survived the assaults of the Goths, the Vandals, and the Huns. Though clouded and obscured, it had never been smitten, and though its light reached but a little way, where previously it had shone over all, it had never been extinguished. The extinction of the Western Empire, AD 476 or AD 479, royalty was familiar to the barbarians, and the submissive peoples of Italy were prepared to obey without a murmur the authority which he should condescend to exercise as a vicegerent of the Emperor of the West. But Odoacer resolved to abolish that useless and expensive office, and such is the weight of the antique prejudice that it required some boldness and penetration to discover the extreme felicity of the enterprise. The unfortunate Augustulus was made the instrument of his own disgrace, and he signed his resignation to the Senate, and that assembly, in their last act of obedience to the Roman prince, still affected the spirit of freedom and of the forms of the Constitution. An epistle was addressed by their unanimous decree to the Emperor Zeno, that was in the east, in Constantinople, the son-in-law and successor of Leo, who had lately been restored after a short rebellion to the Byzantine throne. They solemnly disclaimed the necessity or even of the wish of continuing any longer the imperial succession in Italy, since in their opinion the majesty of a sole monarch is sufficient to pervade and to protect at the same time both the East and the West. In their own name and in the name of the people, they consent that the seat of universal empire shall be transferred from Rome to Constantinople. And they basically renounced the right of choosing their master, the only vestige which yet remained of the only authority which had given laws to the world. This is the final demise of the empire in the West. In 476, the emperor was, by law, banded, and they elected to have only the emperor in the East to rule and to protect the empire in the West. This was done by Odoacer, and he was one of the Goths. He was one of the Goths. And he was also, all these also, by the way, were, they had a very unfortunate run-in with them, but the majority of the last invaders were all also Arians. They were believed in the doctrine of Arius, which had come into the church, I believe, in the 2nd century. But that's another story. So now we come to the most important of all the trumpets. Well, the first four are actually just as important, but where I wanted to get was the 5th and 6th trumpet. And so, you guys want to take a break before we get to the 5th and 6th trumpet?
Sure.
Want to take a break? All right, let's have a prayer, and then we'll get to the 5th and 6th trumpet. Loving Father in heaven,